Welcome, everybody, to the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I have here with me my good friend, Joe Fraiman, who's been a regular guest on the podcast. Welcome back, Joe. So this time we have something kind of different. Joe has just published a paper on with a very provocative hypothesis about why the population of the world has become more obese. This is something I haven't told regular podcast listeners, but actually in a previous life, I was very, very interested in the population biology of obesity and the economics of obesity. I published a whole bunch of papers on it. And so when Joe mentioned that he was also interested in this topic, I was absolutely amazed that we had shared this common interest. And Joe's paper is an incredibly provocative paper. The argument that I'll let him make the argument in full, but let me just say that the argument he makes is that there has actually been genetic pressure that can explain the rise in obesity around the world in a very simple way, and it addresses specifically the complaint that about this hypothesis before, which is that there was no mechanism of genetic change that could result in such rapid rise in obesity. Like the kind of genes that cause obesity are not the kinds of genes that would lead us to expect a rapid population change. And so a lot of scholars in the field had sort of rejected the idea of population genetic change as a cause of obesity and instead focused on other explanations, some of which we'll talk about, having more to do with the nature of the food that we eat, the structure of exercise, the incentives and structure of work and exercise, and a whole range of other hypotheses. But Joe, you've replaced that with a much simpler idea that in fact the genetic hypothesis still works. So why don't you give us a summary, how is it that you have what have you discovered?
So before I think we even go there, I think it's important just to point out the reason that I'm sure you were drawn into explaining what is the cause of the obesity epidemic, as I was drawn, and several other scientists I know it wasn't an obvious path for them to go and chase, is because the cause of the obesity epidemic is unknown. And most people, I don't think, realize this, and that everyone sort of has this idea that the cause of the obesity epidemic is obvious. People are eating too much and they're not exercising. Yeah,
the idea is that it's just mass loss of willpower, which can't possibly be the reason. There has to be other structural reasons.
Yeah, it's essentially that is, I believe, essentially the explanation, or that, the new foods were introduced at this exact time everywhere in the world at the same time, and then everyone, and also there's been a loss of willpower. In fact, there was a New York Times article written maybe 2 years ago saying this obesity conference, all scientists, there's no known, they cannot agree on a cause, but here's what they all do agree on. And that was that it isn't the loss in willpower. I think there was a political component of this. And the other thing they agree on is that there hasn't been a genetic change. Now, in my opinion, you kind of would need one of those two, but that is what the article was saying. And so you have this issue. Every time you hear about the obesity epidemic, you hear that obesity is incredibly heritable. The studies on this are pretty undeniable. The range of this is, we're looking at around 80% of obesity being heritable.
Can I just we're going to do a little aside on this, because I think it's so interesting for listeners to hear, to understand, to break down the evidence of that. Right. So, for instance, there are studies from Korean twins adopted into American families after the Korean War. So you have two identical Korean twins, one adopted into family A, one adopted into family B, and then the families have different, maybe the brothers, stepbrothers, and stepsisters of the Korean kids. Some of maybe they'll be adopted into a family that's fatter, and others will be adopted into a family that's thinner. And the question is the correlation between the obesity rates of the twins, the identical twins, put into different family environments, is it higher with their identical twin, or is it higher with their stepbrothers and stepsisters? And it turns out that there's almost no correlation in the body weight with the stepbrothers and stepsisters. Almost all the correlations with the identical twins themselves. If you were a fatter identical twin, then you were likely to be fatter. If you were, it didn't matter whether your stepbrother and stepsisters were fatter or thinner.
Yes, it's a classic nature nurture type of a question. It's the environment. As the environment of where you grow up matter, and all of the twin studies pretty much say the environment has very little effect. They have genetic variance, which is heritability, which is about 80%. But the other 20% actually typically isn't really environment. It's actually randomness. Like the environment has in those twin studies, and it's not just that Korean study. There's
lots and lots of studies like that.
Tons of these twin studies all saying the same thing on the genetics. We go into the major different ideas that exist on the obesity epidemic. What's caused it? There's people say we've eaten too much. People saying we're eating bad things. People say we're not exercising. Then there's 20 other different potential ideas. And all of these definitely do influence obesity. But the thing that's been agreed upon for so long is that we know the gene pool didn't change. And I just made a general question of what if the gene pool did change, and started thinking down that road and came to this idea that to me seemed actually quite absurd at first, but it was about 10 years ago that the idea came to me. And since then I've been trying to prove the idea wrong because it seemed so crazy. And to quickly summarize this idea, what I believe occurred, what the hypothesis actually is, I'm not even sure I could say I believe it because I'm not certain it's true. But the hypothesis is that in the 1930s to 1940s, we invented the field of obstetrics, which has probably saved more human life than any other field in medicine. I learned that from going into this, and we'll get into those details. But we know obesity and childbirth is a high risk factor. It is much more deadly for mother and baby to have an obese mother. And so if this was essentially creating a strong, what's called a selection pressure. And what happened with obstetrics is it was removed. So then that would lead to an increase in the gene pool of these obesogenic genes, meaning a gene that makes people obese. And you have this that happens about after 1945. And then within 30 years later, we start having the obesity epidemic. Now, what I want to show today, what I want to walk people through today is that a rapid change in the gene pool is possible. Okay. I think that's an important point that I think that we need to establish. I want to establish that the time points that I just discussed there are reasonable with what we have seen within the obesity epidemic, and that there is actually evidence that exists suggesting that it has occurred. And that is to support the hypothesis. For the study, we then made predictions based on this and tried to say, what could we do to test if this idea is possible? And that ended up being the study.
So we'll talk about the empirical evidence in just a bit, but I want to flesh out some of the theoretical argument that you're making.
Please.
So first, the argument is that there was a discrete improvement in how the technology of giving birth, like medicine discovered better ways so that the probability of dying when you're giving birth as a mom is much lower post 1935, 1945 than 1945, before. Yeah. Right. In fact, the lifetime risk of dying from giving birth was actually in the you like to say the 19th century, 18th century, in all the prehistory was actually quite high, right? I mean, in the paper you have some estimates for poor countries of on the order of, for obese moms, 60% of dying at some point in time.
Well, no, it was in 1990. There are several African nations that had
that's it.
Lifetime maternal death rates. So at some point in their life, they will die during childbirth. There was multiple over 10% of them were dying during childbirth. The highest was Sierra Leone at about 15%. So that's, about 1 in 8, we're talking 1 in 8 women dying.
And there's a 4-fold increase in risk of dying if you're an obese mom than if you're a thin mom. So I think that's the base of the calculation you had in the paper.
That is, yes. And I actually think that if you take this idea that obesity is this high risk factor for childbirth, which it most definitely is, and there's a 3 to 4-fold increase today. If you look at the historical causes of death during childbirth, every single one of them is something that obesity worsens. And if you consider during that time period, they were actually without these treatments, and it's actually plausible that the relative risk was even worse without the medical interventions that we have today. And just for curious individuals, those interventions were C-section. All of these happened from 1930s to 1940s. C-section, blood transfusions, preeclampsia treatment, which is this kind of high blood pressure, then seizure disorder. We invented antibiotics, and insulin was discovered in the 20s, but didn't come into common use in the 1930s. And insulin being,
gestational diabetes. Right.
And if you consider insulin, actually, within a lot of the numbers we'll be talking about, insulin doesn't only improve maternal mortality, because you can imagine that a case of gestational diabetes before insulin, some of them would just die way before giving birth, because they would go into a diabetic crisis, and the diabetes would kill them potentially even before we knew they were pregnant. So it's and then there's one other was a drug called ergomotrin, which is just the first drug used to stop bleeding after. So all these happened within the 1930s to 1940s and dramatically reduced obstetrical death. Each birth was about 1% at the time, or above that, and it essentially reduced it to close to zero. We still, of course, have women die during childbirth, and those are tragedies. But we go from about 1% to down to almost zero, 0.01%. It's right. And the same is true for all of this applies not only to maternal mortality, it's also the mortality of the child, which is called perinatal, meaning a combination of stillbirths and death within the first month of an infant. And obese women today also have a much higher risk of that. And again, presumably it would have been higher without the medical interventions that we currently have.
So you have these suite of interventions that vastly improve maternal mortality rates, reduce them from, as high as, as you say, in a poor country in 1990 for obese mom, 60% over a lifetime, down to like just a small fraction, like a very, very, very few women die in childbirth, whether obese or not.
I just want to explain, because I'm not sure if people listening can catch why you said 60%. So it comes from this idea that Sierra Leone in 1990 has a 15% lifetime death rate of maternal mortality. So what we can do is if the relative risk of obesity is 4-fold, then, and we presume that Sierra Leone in 1990 was similar to other nations prior to obstetrics over the last thousands of years, then if they have a 4-fold increase in death, then obese women, instead of that 15% lifetime death rate, they would end up with a 60%, because that's
although for every single birth it'll be less, like
1 to 2% chance of death. But if you're having somewhere between 5 and 10 children, which was pretty commonplace historically, it leads to an incredibly high lifetime rate of death within.
Okay, so I want to explore that for just seconds, because I read that in the paper. I had a question about that. So imagine a obese mom, and so let's take that 4-fold increase. Each birth would be like on the order of 4% mortality for each birth. You have a whole bunch of kids, but like 4% each birth, you may have as many kids before you actually sort of draw the short straw. Even at a rate as high as 4%, right? It's still 96% survival. So it seems to me like the selective pressure that you're talking about would be mitigated by that probability kind of idea. Like there's going to be, I mean, you'll get some selective pressure. Maybe the moms that are obese have fewer kids because of this mortality rate, or not. I mean, there's complicated other factors potentially involved.
Their child mortality though of the first month, it's about 14% for historically combined stillbirths and deaths in the first month of life. Also about a 4-fold increase in relative risk. So you're talking that of the women who survive childbirth, about half of their children will not survive in the first month. So it's on both sides. So even the ones that do have children, they will have 50% less children on about, give or take. That's a gross estimate of it, but they'll have about half as many survive past the first month. So it's a pretty dramatic that versus 15% dying, or so it's 85% surviving versus 40% surviving type of a thing.
So now what that means then over like a long course of history is that the kids that would have the kinds of genes that would lead them to become obese, they either don't get born because their moms died before they were born, or if they're born, they're more likely to die in childhood and not pass on those genes. Mm-hmm. Right? That's the argument you're making.
And yes, and if that was the only pressure that existed, we would have zero obesity genes in our gene pool.
Let's explore that for a minute.
Yeah.
Why do we have obesity genes? Like, in fact, so let me just give you a theory that I've heard. And it's not a directly genetic theory, but an epigenetic theory. The idea is that we have sets of genes that make us able to survive in famine, and sets of genes and similar genes, the same sets of genes, like one set of gene pathways that allow us to survive in famine, and another set of genes and pathways that allow us to survive in times of plenty. But that's set in birth, set in utero, right? So there's a very famous study called the Dutch famine study, which I'm sure you know of. Mm-hmm. But the study looked at what happened when the Nazis starved the various neighborhoods in the Netherlands during their occupation in World War II. And what they would do, the Nazis would do, is that if there was any resistance in a neighborhood, they would cut off all food supplies to that neighborhood, whereas other neighborhoods next door would have food supplies. And what researchers did is they looked and saw, which moms gave birth in those neighborhoods that were starved by the Nazis, compared to just a few doors down, moms giving birth to babies not in that starvation environment, and track them for a very, very long period of time, track the kids for a long period of time. And it turns out that if you were born of a mom that was starved by the Nazis in the Netherlands in World War II, 50 years later, you were more likely to be obese, you were more likely to have hypertension, metabolic syndrome, all the things, versus compared to the babies that were born in neighborhoods that weren't starved. Mm-hmm. And the idea is a thrifty gene hypothesis. Like there's something in the exposure to starvation
it's not thrifty gene hypothesis. It's thrifty gene hypothesis is a little different. That one's an epigenetic. The epigenetic hypothesis.
Sure. Okay, fine. Mm-hmm. I'll stick to what I had earlier. Epigenetic. The point is that there's an epigenetic modification of the genes that allow the babies. The signal is that they're going to live a life of starvation in utero, yep. Mm-hmm. and the epigenetic modification makes it so that they have metabolic pathways that are well adapted for starvation. Mm-hmm. But when they live their life, of course, post World War II, it's not a environment of deprivation. It's an environment of plenty, actually.
Yeah.
Whereas the babies that were not starved during did not face starvation during childhood, didn't have that epigenetic modifications. They were much better adapted to live in that environment of plenty. So if it's genes by itself, actually, your point is actually a great one. Like if it can't just be genes by itself. There's other really important modifications that happen related to the environment that you face in childhood or in utero.
I agree, but I would also add that within the twin study heritability way we look at this, that would actually end up looking as heritability because those twins were in the same belly at the same time of starvation. So by using the twin study, that would actually, but I think for the most part, this epigenetic concept, that's probably real. And it's a thing that influences obesity. And there's a lot of things that influence obesity in addition to these epigenetic effects of famine and such. But I think in general, we're not seeing that anymore. We're not seeing famine leading to obesity, leading to famine, we're not seeing this.
In rich countries, we all have that epigenetic modification that allows us to survive in plenty.
Yes, I don't think that it doesn't seem like we should have that. I think that we're not looking for that right now, even though it's definitely a factor that is like, and I think it's important actually to point out that all of the other hypotheses that people have or proponents things of different drivers of obesity. The hypothesis that we're putting forward here does not suggest that those are wrong. We're not suggesting that eating a lot doesn't make you put on a couple pounds, as we all know intuitively. It is saying that there's been a genetic change in the population globally that is the parsimonious answer for why every country in the world is seeing an increase in their BMI, in their obesity, because all the different drivers that people think about, famine could be one, increasing calorie intake, all decreasing physical activity, increasing corn syrup, decreasing sleep, increasing psychiatric medications, yada, yada. It's just we know that not every country in the world's had these. So, and what's happened a lot with the obesity epidemic is people just look at, what makes people fatter? What makes people heavier? And then they say, we find these things that make people heavier. But something happened in a time period that changed our weight in a way that has not occurred in all of human existence as an entire population. And so you need something that actually every population's been exposed to. And that's kind of the driver of what makes people look for what is this singular cause, because it's almost, when it happens everywhere and there's no exception, it's difficult to argue logically that there isn't a single cause everywhere.
Yeah, I think this is something that people, when they write about obesity, often forget, and I completely agree with you about that. Like the universality of the rise in obesity over the last decades is an absolutely remarkable fact. When I say universality, I mean it affects every social class, it affects every country, and there are very, very, very few exceptions. Like you have to have
there's no exceptions.
Well, like you could have times of war, for instance, where you see. Yeah.
So I could say, from the data we even collected within our study, since 1990, every single nation in the world has had an increase in their BMI. Every single one. You could find 2 or 3 year periods.
Yeah, so you look at the Japanese data, for instance, it's much slower. Mm-hmm. Cuban data, it's again slow. Like there's some, but it's very small. Yes. But the point is that, like, and I'm agreeing with you about this, there's a lot that is essentially it's universal.
And while that's happening, of those nations, 25% of those nations did not have increasing calorie intake. Some of them had decreasing calorie intake.
Okay, so now let me throw a couple of alternate theories at you, at least one alternate theory at you, and talk about the calorie, because the calorie numbers are often very difficult to measure. That you need dietary intake diaries that people, there's like a lot of error, I think, in people remembering exactly, and then of course the measurement of the calories themselves. You can do calorie purchases, but you don't know how much food waste there is. So there's noise around that. So I mean, so you could tell stories about this, but let me tell you an alternate theory that I think competes with your theory, and that is that because it has the same timeline.
Actually, wait. I think I want to hear a lot. I want to hear critiques, but I kind of think it's more important that we kind of.
I thought we'd do the theory first, and then you can give the evidence.
Yeah, well, I want to deliver.
All right, we'll do it your way, Joe.
Before we get to critiques,
this wasn't a critique. It was an alternate. Oh, whatever. I'll let you go, dude. By the way, listeners, Joe and I are good friends, and this is exactly how all of our conversations go.
It's true.
All right, Joe. Let's do it your way. Why don't you tell the listeners the evidence that you developed for your theory that there's genetic change due to improvements in maternal obstetric technology?
Yes. So the first thing that is, I think, important to grasp is this idea that is a rapid change in our gene pool even possible? Because in the 1980s, 1990s, when we were looking at this obesity epidemic starting, people thought it wasn't possible for our gene pool to change. Since then, there's actually been change in evolutionary theory. And we now know it's actually possible to have a massive change in the gene pool and very quickly. And the way that happens is because people think of evolution as a new mutation occurs, and that could take 1 million years before the mutation occurs in response to environmental changes. But for certain traits that exist, there is something called large standing genetic variation. And what that means essentially is that there's thousands of genes, and each one of those genes has a very small influence on the phenotype, on how you look. So for obesity, it has that exactly. There's thousands of genes probably that control obesity, but each one has a very, very small impact on your actual chance of having a higher BMI. And then this leads to something called hidden heritability, which means our genome studies, we can't find any of the genes. So even though we know from the twin studies that that there's a large amount of genetic control here, likely controlled by thousands of genes, where we are right now think that we have about maybe 2 or 3%. We've only been able to identify 2 or 3% of them, and each one of them can only influence your total BMI by 0.1, like a very small factor. So each gene itself doesn't really control your BMI, but together they have an incredibly large influence on it. When you have that type of a trait, if you have a large change in environmental pressure, you could have a rapid change in the gene pool in a single generation. A single generation can change the gene pool. And when you have large standing genetic variation, like you do with obesity, you don't need that much change to cause a large difference in the trait. So we offer an example in our paper that it's just a mathematical way of looking at this, is that to do the math, we say, okay, if we presume there's 1,000 obesity genes, and each one of them on average essentially only makes you have a BMI increase of 0.1. And if you change that by just 5%, you will increase the BMI of the population by 5. So you'd have a BMI of 25. The average BMI of 25 can go to a BMI of 30, which is obese. And so it's actually quite possible for a gene pool to change rapidly under the right circumstance. Obesity has the first part, the large standing genetic variation. The second part is the massive change in the environment. What we talked about before was the introduction of obstetrics. And that was an incredibly massive change in evolutionary pressure. Because
you don't need, in other words, you don't need a new mutation, an obese gene that just sort of randomly pops up that's selected. It's that you already have within your genetic sort of endowment the capacity to be obese. Yes. And the only question is what fraction of people have those parts of their genetic endowment more expressed than in this new environment than in the previous environment before the obstetric change. That's that if I'm reading the theory right.
But it wouldn't work for a trait that's controlled by like 2 or 3 genes. Okay, it's a gene when it's controlled by thousands of genes. That essentially means that we all have some obesogenic genes and some, but just to a different degree. But if you just have 1 or 2, then this doesn't work as well. You can't get the massive change in the gene pool population if there's just a handful of genes. And so, as we discussed before, that crazy mortality data and the change that obstetrics led to, the major thing to grasp is that the relative risk, fourfold increase today, with maternal mortality being 0.01 or 0.1%. If it's fourfold and it goes to 0.4%, that has a negligible influence on any evolutionary pressure. But if you have a difference of 60 versus 15%, which is what we were talking about, that means that like 85% of women who aren't obese survive childbirth. They don't die of childbirth. And only 40% of obese women would survive their entire life without dying during childbirth. It's a massive, massive difference. And that similar number is for the ones who survive childbirth. Their children, a large number of their children aren't going to make it. And for a selection pressure like that, there's a situation called stabilizing selection pressure. 2 forces, a positive and a negative. There has to be a positive force that has been in existence for all time that was countering this, or else we'd have zero obesity.
Else we would be thin. Everyone would be thin very quickly, right?
It has to exist.
Hi, everyone. A quick word from our first and exciting sponsor, Alchemy Elements. Alchemy Elements is a powerful adaptogenic supplement. For those of you who don't know, adaptogens are a class of plant compounds, primarily herbs and mushrooms, which can help build the mind and body's resistance to stress. Alchemy Elements contains a very unique and carefully selected blend of 9 adaptogens, such as lion's mane, cordyceps, polygalaroot, and shilajit, and they can help boost energy, boost your immunity, and increase focus and overall stabilize your mood. It can have a wide array of effects, which can often depend from individual to individual, but it's a great way to start your morning and generally increase your focus and your energy levels. You can just pour 1 scoop of Alchemy Elements into your morning coffee or your protein shake or smoothie, and you're off to the races. It's a great way to start the day. I use it every day. I find that it can generally stabilize my mood levels and increase focus, especially if I want to get a big project done or finish a very important task. Alchemy Elements often is a great way to kind of start and get my focus going and get me primed for whatever task I want to accomplish. We're very excited and very happy to work with Alchemy Elements. We've been working with them for a couple of months, and now in this new iteration of the podcast, we're going to continue our relationship, which is very special to us because Alchemy aligns with our mission and values of individuals taking greater ownership of their personal mental and physical health and relying less and less on corrupt and flawed generalized kind of medical advice, and less reliance on pharmaceutical drugs, and more of general interest and focus on holistic health. For a limited time, Illusion of Consensus readers and listeners can get 10% off their first order using the code word illusion, or 30% off a subscription monthly order, where you can get a monthly shipment of Alchemy Elements delivered to you. For the subscription orders, you can also get with it a bonus gold kit to store your Alchemy Elements. Overall, I think Alchemy is a fantastic product. I highly recommend you check them out in the link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening, Spotify, Apple, Substack, Rumble, or YouTube. Just go to the link, use the code word illusion, and you can get your discount and you won't regret it.
And I think that there actually have been multiple positive selection forces and it doesn't have to be a positive selection force for obesity. it actually also could be a negative selection force against being too skinny. And because those are sort of the same thing. And so, and there probably have been many of those in different places at different times. And that's why there's differences in ethnic groups between their genetic propensity towards obesity. As we know that East Asian populations have by far the lowest propensity to obesity. And it varies across, different nations. And we see that all over the world. And it's almost obvious that these differences between ethnic groups exist. But I think that the thing that is constant for all of them, because I think that the positive selection forces could change, especially with technology. But the thing that can't change is the floor, the bottom. You can't have a BMI of 7, right? That would be, an adult who weighs, 40 pounds. It's not compatible with life. The lowest that I think exists historically is a BMI of 11. And so what would happen is if you ended up with a combination of obesity genes that was too low, there's two things. One is it would probably cause a spontaneous abortion. The BMI is too low to survive. If they're born, they'll probably fail to thrive. If they survive birth, these super skinny women are unable to give birth themselves. So we know that there's a floor. You can't be nothing. You can't weigh, almost nothing. That's not survivable. So that we didn't get rid of. That's definitely still there, that positive pressure. So now,
and actually in poor societies, there's also sex selection, I think, that matters here, right? So if you are in poor societies, it's richer people who tend to be fatter and poorer people who tend to be thinner. Mm-hmm. So obesity is a marker of wealth, mm-hmm. Which I think would push in the direction of a selection force in favor of obesity.
Well, I think there's two arguments for it. One, is the idea that the wealthy are eating more in these poor countries, right? And I think that's a reasonable thing and probably does play a role. And it also fits with this hypothesis that we're proposing here, in that generally wealth stays within families over time. And if you were wealthy in 1945 in a poor country that had that the general population didn't have access to good obstetrics, the wealthy population probably did get Western level obstetrics, and they've probably been getting it since 1945. So they would have been exposed to the same change in environmental pressure that the poorer population would not have been exposed to.
It could be both, is the point.
Yes. Right? Yeah. As I say throughout this entire thing here, that to be very clear, this hypothesis is not suggesting that calorie intake has nothing to do with your weight. It most certainly does. The problem is that calorie intake does not explain the reason for the global obesity epidemic.
So there's a difference between population level versus individual level. I mean, you're talking about population level forces to explain a population level phenomenon, mm-hmm. Rather than individual advice about what you should or should not eat or exercise.
Right. Like if we had a skinny epidemic starting in the 1980s, we could go and look at all the things that changed in the 1980s that made people more skinny. Right. There was a crack cocaine epidemic. Maybe that led to the skinniness epidemic. Right. Like we could come up with a ton of things that are correlated that individually lead to this, but clearly didn't lead to the epidemic. Doesn't necessarily mean that they caused the obesity epidemic just because they cause obesity they can cause obesity in an individual. So it's just, those are different. They're just slightly different things that I think people have a little difficulty
disentangling.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, let's stick with the population level stuff. What evidence do you develop that's suggestive that your hypothesis has some legs?
Well, first, just to understand this whole idea that imagine for people to understand how powerful this removal of a stabilizing pressure would be. Imagine that you had, given those obstetrical numbers, we could say it's about every generation would see a 50% reduction in their obese population. and essentially a 50% reduction in their obesity promoting genes. Yet we believe that the obesity promoting genes were relatively stable. So they were constantly, so all the ones that are being lost through death are being replaced every generation. And if you're losing 50%, that means that 50% is being returned back in. So now imagine a hypothetical with a population of where you have a population gene pool, 10% of them are obesity promoting genes. Now, 50% gone. So that means normally every generation, 5% of those obesogenic genes, they die. They don't get passed on, but 5% come back from some method, floor effect being probably a strong part of it, but other things can be part of that too. But they're essentially stable. Now,
I mean, if you could have you could. This is the thing with like evolutionary stories. You can tell yourself ideas about what happened in the ancestral time that made it so that it would be a good thing to have in your genetic endowment some obesity promoting genes, right? To store energy when it's like not.
They're called obesity promoting, but they're also like malnourished avoiding.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not. I don't think that's not a difficulty for your theory, really. The existence of obesity promoting genes and the continuing existence of them in the human genetic endowment makes complete sense. It's like there kind of has to be that,
but
for humanity to survive.
If you take that population with a 10% of their gene pools is obesity promoting genes. The moment we invented in a short time period, 10 years, obstetrics, we removed the negative selection pressure. So in that next generation, the obesogenic genes would go from 10% to 15%. In a single generation, you would have that large of an increase. And remember before, I explained a 5% increase in the gene pool is enough to create a massive change in the phenotype for something like obesity, which has large standing genetic variation. And then the pattern, the timing of this is a little weird for people because I'm talking about 1945, but the obesity epidemic didn't start until the 70s. And what happened there is, if my hypothesis is correct, and I'm not, as I continue to say, I'm not certain it is, but if it is correct, it actually does fit this. And the reason is because the obesity epidemic started in the 1970s because we were looking at the percentage of obese people in the adult population. And if you were born in 1945, right, you became an adult essentially 1965. But you only represented a very small percentage of the total adult population. So you would only, the day they become adults, it's not like, now we're going to see the obesity epidemic.
So there's one other factor there that I think is really important. There's an age distribution in obesity, even holding the genetics constant, right? You're going to be, your basal metabolic rate will tend to get lower as you get older. You'll tend to be. Know. Yes, unfortunately. And so like the same. The fact is, like, if you have a bunch of 20-year-olds with obesity promoting genes, that they're still going to be thinner than their elderly parent or older parents, like middle-aged parents or whatever, because they're young. But the question is, at the same age, were they thinner or were they more obese than their parents? The answer is yes.
Yes, because there's an excellent study that looks at birth cohorts. If we look at not just when did the obesity epidemic start, just here's the percentage goes high, but if you look at it when you were born, what you see is that while there was actually a very slow increase in obesity for the last 100 years, but what happens is that exactly 1945, it takes off, and if you were born after 1945, I believe 1945 or 1942, 1945 essentially. If you're born after 1945, in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, you were much more obese than the generations before you. So this idea that we live in this obese promoting environment with all these bad foods around it actually wasn't the case that in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was a group of people who were born after the 1940s who were creating the large amount of the obesity while their parents were not part of that obesity in a sense. And they were, so there was a less obese if you were born beforehand, but they were all living during the same time. So what happens, what you see here is that being born after 1945 put you at high risk for obesity later. And that does not fit with this idea that the obesogenic environment just started in the 1970s and 80s. And there is, there's other evidence that also confirms that like the calorie intakes for multiple countries didn't even change that much during from the 1980s. There's an example with Switzerland that we mentioned in our study where from the 60s to it was essentially from the periods in a period of time from the 50s to the 70s, you had an increase in calories by 17%, 3,000 to 3,500. Obesity rates don't change at all. Then the calorie intake stays the same from the 1980s on. It's about 35 to 3,300, wobbles back and forth. Obesity rate jumps up from 5% to 20% with essentially no change in the calorie intake. So you have multiple discrepancies that exist here that make it difficult to, and it's why Jay and I both ended up falling into looking at what caused the obesity epidemic, because it's been mysterious to us, because it's not as obvious as it's kind of seems to most people. It's not.
Yeah, it's definitely a puzzle. Can I throw a couple more pieces into the puzzle?
Yeah, please.
Mix for this. So I have a paper. It's still under peer review that I think it's about to be published. But the paper, what it asks is what has happened to the probability of survival into old age. What's happened to the probable mortality rates based on body weight? Mm-hmm. And it turns out that over time, the body weight at which you get minimum mortality has increased, especially in rich countries.
Yes. Yeah.
So we're better at managing and keeping alive people who have metabolic syndrome, who have some of the heart issues related to obesity, who have some of the conditions associated, the chronic conditions associated with obesity. We're better at keeping people alive now than we were, let's say 30 years ago.
To a degree, not
It's actually larger than you'd think, Joe. So like the minimum mortality combination of body weight and height is actually shifted pretty rapidly to the right.
No, on average.
Yeah.
But take a severely obese 500-pound person is unlikely to live into their 80s.
Yeah, no, that's true. Like the extremes are different. But I'm saying like a BMI, if someone with BMI of 28 now actually has relatively low mortality than compared to what they would have had 30 years ago, right? There's a big shift in the probability of survival, conditional on having a higher average. I'm not talking 500. I mean,
yes, you're saying you're actually talking about that's not even 28 is not even obese. But even up to 30. Now, if you look in poorer countries, there's been less of that shift, right? So the mortality, the minimum mortality rate, obesity rate, a BMI is not shifted nearly as much. In rich countries, it's shifted quite a bit. And so that I think that also I think that actually feeds into your argument, Joe. It feeds because what it does is it allows an acceleration of this the survival of obese populations of the obese genes in richer countries anyway. Possibly mostly for males though, because we're talking about kind of low.
It's you see it in both men and women. I don't know if I've said.
I'm talking about reproductive age.
Reproductive. Yeah, we were looking at the entire population of women, so I don't know. We didn't look specifically at reproductive age. That'll be interesting.
So I think we've established here right now from everything I went through. I think that it's clear from what I've said, it's possible that the gene pool could change rapidly. And we've established there was an environmental change that creates the scenario for when it could have happened. That is not evidence that it's happened. That's just saying it's plausible. And now I want to say go through what evidence do we have that maybe this has occurred. And the twin studies, like we were discussing before, have actually found very consistent findings. And they are that if you look at twins born more recently, since probably the 40s and such, what you see is that the heritability of BMI has increased over time. And there's been zero change in the influence of environment, as we had discussed before. Now, in that would pretty much, I think, any simple interpretation of that would have said, okay, the genes, we've had an increase in the genetic proponent of obesity. But what's happened is because they have presumed that there's definitely been no increase in genetics, they've come up with alternative explanation for that consistent finding. And I want to read a quote here that I pulled from a study on this where they review this. They said, one would presume the emergence of a society characterized by food abundance and physical inactivity may increase the impact of environment and therefore decrease the impact of genes in the determination of the obese phenotypes. Counterintuitively, the proportion of variability in BMI attributable to genetic variation is increased among people born after the establishment of a modern obesogenic environment. Now, what he's saying there is that the genes have playing a larger role. And what they have done to explain this is they are saying it's, I think, a reasonable explanation if you believe it's not possible that the gene pool has changed. They're saying that there's a gene dependent, there's environmental dependent genes.
Yeah, this is the epigenetic story would be consistent with that.
No, it's not epigenetic. It's genetic. It's saying that, your genes are saying that if you don't have to, do physical activity because you're not forced to based on your farming life, some people will still do it and some people won't, and their genes are the determining factor. But only when you get put into the environment will you see these differences exist. And so the explanation is that these are all environment-dependent genes, and they all came into effect when the environment changed for them. The problem with that is that's not the best interpretation of that data, and that's because under such a scenario, we would expect that you would see increasing influence of both genes and environment, but instead you only see increasing influence of genes, and you do not see increasing influence of environment. So while that's still the best explanation, the environmental dependent genes have now been exposed to the new environment. That is the best explanation if the gene pool didn't change. But if it's possible that the gene pool did change, that needs to be considered as an interpretation, a potential interpretation of all of these.
I guess I don't see the need for having that. These are not competing theories in the sense of you need one to be wrong for the other to be right. It seems to me like you could have both be true at the same time.
Well, yes, they are both true. There is, I'm sure, an increase in environment gene interaction that I'm sure has occurred as well. So yes, I agree. It's just that the change in environment doesn't explain the cause of the obesity epidemic is the thing that I'm chasing. You're correct. And it's like that. We keep coming back to this because it's a common hang-up in that, like, it's not that it isn't happening, but it just doesn't explain the global nature of it happening in every country in the world.
So here now it might be a good time to like put in my alternate hypothesis that you put off for a second. So let me just say what it is, which is and it actually could be through the same mechanism. The right around the time that you're talking about this technological leap in obstetrics, there was also a very, very sharp change in agricultural practice that led to basically a collapse in the price of food. Right, the Green Revolution happens, I think, in like what is 1960s, and so you have and you also have again around the same time a very, very significant shift in the nature of the workforce, so that There are many fewer people working in agriculture. The total amount of caloric output for work also collapses right around the same time.
That's the thing, but that's
and it's a worldwide phenomenon, right?
And you're talking about the 1950s and 60s, though, correct?
Yeah,
but
right around that.
But we should have seen it, with that. We should have seen it immediately, I think. Right? We should have seen.
But we did. I mean, so you do see some increases in body weight. There's a really interesting paper by this economic historian Dora Costa, looking at American veterans. Actually, before in the intake, in order to go into the army, they do an assessment of body weight and so on, and age, and she looks going back as far back as the Civil War, and you see this rise in body weight for different age groups of American men entering into military service. And it goes all the way. I mean, it's interesting how far back it goes. It doesn't actually start in the 70s.
Yes, there's been a very slow progression for about at least 100 years, most likely.
Yeah, or longer, actually. Yeah.
That study I mentioned earlier that was looking at obesity rates by birth cohort, there has actually been a slow increase, and also to the same point where, and I think these are both reasonable competing hypotheses. I think that yours it's not. I can't say it's wrong. I guess I'm bristling a little at the word competing. I'm not even sure they're competing hypotheses. Not necessarily. They could both occur simultaneously.
Yeah, it could very easily be. I don't see. It's not. This is not like either the Earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the Earth. It's not. It has to be one or the other.
I hear you on that. It is plausible that there's more than one thing that has led to this, and but yeah, no, I agree.
Okay, so now I really want you to get to the empirical evidence. I think it's really interesting. The empirical evidence you developed for the
before
paper.
I get there, I just want to run through the genetic data that has already existed, because that would be the problem is that we only know 2 to 3% of the genes of obesity. But what I've been able to put together is that multiple studies have found increases in the genes using these genome-wide studies. There's one study that found an increase in the FTO, which is the most famous of the obesity genes. That was done by a Rosenquist et al. And then there's another study showing that these BMI risk scores increased from 1924 into 1958. We just see an increasing in the genetic risk score, which doesn't actually make sense, except for that there's been a change in the genes. And then these
are like genome-wide association studies. These are
genome-wide association studies. And then there's a recent study in
where do they get the genetic codes for people from the 19? Oh, they just get older people.
Older people. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then there's this other study that was essentially found that since the 1930s, we've seen this increasing in this obesity genetic risk score. And they also found that it was associated with infant mortality. And they concluded in their study that their data suggests that natural selection is occurring in the contemporary human population. However, because we are only looking at 1, 2, 3% of the gene pool, we can't conclude that those genes are the cause of the obesity epidemic, because we can't use those obesity risk scores to predict if someone's going to be obese or not. They have such a small influence on because we only know a small number of them.
Yeah.
And so we have the data, the evidence is supporting that there's been an increase in the genes in the population.
Just not the magnitude that you're predicting.
We don't know, because we don't know the genes. They don't exist. But.
Right. So your argument is that, look, all of these GWAS kind of studies, it's quite possible they're underestimating the influence of the mechanism you're talking about, because we don't have a complete picture.
They're not necessarily underestimating it, because, for example, there's one study that found about 10% of the obesogenic genes that they were aware of had increased. That is exactly what I would imagine to be enough to create this. So it actually is, if you consider the percentage of them.
I have to tell you though, I mean, Joe, I like when for complex heritable conditions like this,
it's too much.
Our knowledge is it feels like we're in the dark ages still for that.
Yeah, the genetic research on this, I think that people need to understand, is in an infancy. We really don't understand what we're doing there. I'm just seeing that I'm just pointing out that there is some evidence that these things have increased. I don't put that much weight into them. I believe actually almost all the things I've said before are greater evidence than the genetic thing here. And but it is something. Lots of people put a lot of weight on that, and I think they put a little too much weight onto those GWAS studies. But taking this all, we made a couple of predictions. And we use this idea of lifetime maternal death rate. This idea, how often is that a woman will die from childbirth, as an estimate of the evolutionary force, essentially. And the earliest we could get that data is 1990. Ideally, I would have had it from the 40s, but it doesn't exist. And so we did that, and the range of 1990 goes from 0.01 up to about 15%. The median is about 0.5%. We predicted that this historic lifetime maternal death rate would predict obesity rates today. 1990 maternal death rates. And we thought that it should explain it, as well or better, and should explain it independently of the other factors such as calorie intake, physical inactivity, GDP. And we also used antibiotic use. That was our first prediction that we made. And for that, when we run that study, we found that it was the case. Our prediction held. And it was a bold prediction to think that would work. And
can I suggest a follow-on thing? I know you're going to give two different follow-ons, but I wanted this particular I thought would be interesting. That you have 1990 lifetime mortality rate that for women, right? From childbirth. Mm-hmm. What would you predict would happen if you'd used, say, 2000? Like, would the correlation be stronger or less strong from your theory?
We did that actually, and it's weaker, but it's still there, and it's because whatever your maternal mortality was in 1990 is definitely going to be highly correlated to what it's going to be in 2000, 2010, 2020 for them. These correlations stay, even though they're not an act necessarily. Like the 1990 data is actually also predictive of what your 1970 maternal mortality.
So the point is that you're seeing a reflection of the thing you really want is the 1930 or something.
Yeah, 1930, and show that there was no connection. Essentially that was, these were probably not connected.
Yeah, and then mm-hmm. starting in the 40s or 50s, like I guess 50s, you'd have to go to after for enough babies to
Yes, I would agree. That would be the ideal situation, showing that the connection becomes much as it increases. So then what we found there is that we found maternal death rate to be associated with it, independent of all those other factors. And calorie intake was also an independent predictor of national obesity rates. But maternal death rate was actually a stronger predictor than calorie intake. And which is actually shocking in a lot of ways. And and that's the first.
These are. I think the way that you're interpreting it makes some sense. Like you're saying, look, we predict that ought to be a positive correlation, and there is a positive correlation.
And independent,
even after you control for other mm-hmm. factors that you think would contribute to population mm-hmm. Obesity. But these are complicated regressions to interpret. I mean, these are correlations, and of course, there's a lot of other things that could go into them.
Yes. Well, that was why we included antibiotic use. Because we figured that antibiotic use is just a correlation with medical care in general, and and who knows what the other confounding factor is, but antibiotic use was included as the confounder to just represent the introduction of medical care into your country, and the antibiotic use was correlated with obesity, but it was weakly correlated. It's not perfect. I'm with you. I agree. It's not a perfect. We have not gotten rid of every potential confounder, but we've gotten, it is maternal death rate independently predicts 1990 maternal mortality rate independently predicts obesity rate in 2016, independent of that country's calorie intake, independent of that GDP, independent of their physical inactivity. and independent of their antibiotic use. So there could be other confounders that are explaining maternal death rate, but there's none that come to mind that are obvious that should be stronger than I think.
I mean, it just like it's the only. I mean, like you could say like, well, maybe it's a proxy for income or something.
Yes, but it's not. But because we did GDP.
Yeah. So, but you do have but it could also be. I mean, there are, like I could tell stories, right? Like like
Yes.
you're not capturing enough about the poverty rate. I mean, things like this. But
I'm in agreement with you. I'm in agreement.
Yeah. So
with that.
but I do think it's interesting. I wouldn't have necessarily predicted for that correlation to be as strong as it is, and to survive being with the controls you had necessarily.
It was a bold prediction to think would survive independent analysis, because I wouldn't. If this was a total nonsense idea, it shouldn't be expected to escape that controlling for GDP, controlling for calorie intake, and that was the prediction that it would, and we found it. But I'm with you. We have not nailed the case shut on this, and I'm the first to acknowledge that we are open to being wrong. We might be wrong.
Well, I mean, this is how science works, Joe,
Yes.
as you know. Like it's. I mean, you're trying to. I mean, you. I'm sure if you had better data, you would have subjected. But you did more. Like hold on, before we go there, you did a second test.
Yes.
Why don't you describe the second test?
It was an interesting idea. We said because we had this concept of if you take all the nations that have low maternal death rate, they're all, a fraction of a percent. There shouldn't be a difference between low maternal death rate shouldn't have any real predictive power comparing a nation has a 0.1%, and a 0.3%, right? That has the absolute difference is negligible, but the relative difference is massive. So if we were just capturing something that was correlated with maternal death rate, then this kind of concept, it's trying to tease it apart, is I guess the idea. So look at just the people who have, developed world essentially, and then the less developed world. And we luckily had a median that was 0.48%, essentially 0.5% lifetime maternal death rate. So we were comparing the high maternal death rate countries, which are 0.5 to 15%. So there's a major difference in the absolute death rate of these countries. And in the other half of these are half the nations of the world, half and half. The other ones, there's really not much absolute difference. And when you do that in the countries with high maternal death rate, 0.5 to 15%, the association with obesity becomes much stronger, and calorie intake and insufficient physical activity have no association with obesity. They have no they have no association with it. It goes away. The association goes away. Now, if you look at the low maternal death rate countries, low maternal death rate has no association with it, exactly as we would predict. But calorie intake and insufficient physical activity are showing a significant association. And that's exactly what our hypothesis would predict. And it also helps to make sense why I think that calorie intake and physical, because if you think about it, when you look at the nations that have high maternal death rate, calorie intake and physical inactivity having no association with obesity rates, insane, because that's half of the countries of the world. And that is really strong evidence that calorie intake and physical inactivity cannot be the major driver of global obesity epidemic if they don't even have a correlation with it in half the countries of the world. It makes it but it is having an impact on these wealthier nations, on the nations not wealthier. Nations with
in some sense, it has to be there in the background somehow, right? So you have the first law of thermodynamics is conservation of energy.
No, I don't think so. I don't think it does, because over time, if you have a high calorie intake nation and you also have environmentally dependent genes in your nation, then those and you have a high maternal death rate, right? Then those environmental genes will just be squashed from the population very quickly.
No, I mean something just much more narrow. If a population, if an individual, let's just stick with an individual, gains weight,
yes. Mm-hmm.
their body weight must the fact that the body went up means that that in effect the calories in is more than the calories out over the period that the body weight is going up. That's just a
I agree.
physical fact, right?
I agree.
So it has to be there in the background somewhere, right? So it's not surprising. The question is like, how does that play out in the context of the complex environments we live in, the genetic sort of instructions to how we process the calories? It's a necessary part of the story, but not a sufficient part of the story.
Calories out is the problem, right? Because we're just looking calories in, but different groups of people can have different metabolism rates. So
exactly. No, I'm not. I think we're in agreement on this. Actually, I think that it's. I think sometimes people will say that the calories in doesn't matter or the calories out doesn't. I think that's just physically not correct.
No.
But I think sometimes people will say that's all that matters. All you have to do is look at calories in and calories out, and that's enough. And that's also wrong, right? It
is wrong. Yes.
Yeah. The social environment, the technological environment, the genetic environment, genetic endowment play a very, very important role.
And the type of food, the type of calorie is also another component. But
so I think that's all. But that, of course, this is all related to the distinction between population level trends that you're trying to like explain versus the individual, like what happens to an individual person.
I think that what I see from this is that because almost all obesity research is being done in first world nations with low maternal mortality rates. In those nations, calorie intake and physical inactivity is strongly associated.
Yeah, and just like you did, if you run a regression with maternal mortality rates in the regression, you're going to find no effect. There's almost no difference.
No absolute difference. Yeah,
in absolute numbers between obese and thin moms in terms of survival.
So that's, and also to point that the other thing is that the range of calories in these low and high maternal death rate nations, the range is actually similar. It's about 2,000 to 3,500 in both nations. So it's not that in the low, in the places that have a high maternal death rate where calorie intake is not associated with it, that it's like, oh, those are just poor countries and they just are all not eating very much. So there's no difference between them. No, there was a big range. An equal range, and still no association with the variation between them, which is just it's a crazy point, and it's something that I have a concept on. I think it's a difficult thing to communicate, but I think it makes sense. It's just that it is a little hard to explain that quickly. But third prediction, I think, is also really interesting, and it's another bold one that we got a little wrong, and we said there should be 0 nations in the world that have high maternal mortality and high obesity. It's a bold prediction to say. And we then just had to define high maternal mortality. We didn't use the lifetime maternal death rate because there was no definition for what's a high version. But the WHO had a high maternal mortality rate, and it's about 500 per 100,000. High obesity rate, also not clearly defined. We just chose the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and there it was 19.5%, which is lower than the global mean. And so we're using an obesity rate that's lower than the global median for our threshold for high obesity. It's a conservative way to do it. We only looked at developing nations. There was 128 of them. 80 of them had low maternal mortality rates. So 80 of the developing nations are doing not bad, not terrible on maternal mortality. Of those nations, 72% have high obesity rates. There's 48 nations with high maternal mortality, and there is one that has a high obesity rate. So we did get that prediction slightly wrong. But I think that when you look at the detail of it, it's sort of an exception that proves the rule, and that the one nation is Haiti. And you understand that these thresholds, maternal mortality, high obesity, they're arbitrary. They're not based on evolutionary pressures. They're based on just definitions we have.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is like the test you're doing is kind of a crude test in a sense. Like all three of they're worthwhile to do, of course, and they provide they're things that you have surprising correlations you wouldn't have expected, but for your theory. But still, it's a crude. I mean, more refined tests might make sense of that
Yes, I agree. Because Haiti, the answer there is that Haiti's just slightly over the high maternal mortality rate, and they're just slightly over the high obesity definition. So you can see that it's essentially that it's near both thresholds anyway. That it's because these thresholds are arbitrary that it almost is not. Well, the prediction was wrong, I will say. But
do you have Cuba in your data?
Yes.
Okay, because I thought,
is Cuba heavy or skinny?
I think it's skinny, and
so we didn't make a prediction.
But they're low, right? But they're low.
There are many nations with low maternal mortality who don't end up developing high obesity, and that has to do with there's probably multiple reasons why. It's not a having low maternal mortality does not mean that every nation that gets it will become aggressively obese. But for example, the East Asian nations have very low maternal mortality and very low obesity. But every ethnic population will have a different gene pool that they started with before they took away the negative selection pressure of obstetrics. And so you'll end up with it would end up just going, and that's kind of for future area of study, is looking at the rate of increase of nations as they go from 2% to how quickly does their obesity rate change is some other ways that been thinking about on how to look at this in different ways. But and I think that a big part of this that people ask is, so what?
Well, no. So I was going to get to that because I think there is a really important set of so whats. But the so whats aren't necessarily in the what diet should you have, like it, or what sort of like how much you should. It's not personal dietary exercise regimens you're giving here, right?
No.
So the so whats have to do with how you think about obesity, and the sort of like moralization around obesity.
Yes.
And I think that's a really important so what, right? So
I agree. No, I agree completely. I think that it's while we have the scientific movement at some point saying this is not a genetic, there hasn't been a change in genes and there hasn't been a change in willpower is sort of an illogical combination of things because they're trying to not be mean. They don't want to be mean. And I appreciate that. I'm not even insulting it, but then you also have the alternative viewpoint where people are saying like, no, we should fat shame people because that's going to help these people get skinny. But actually that also, sadly, we know from lots of studies that all of our dieting recommendations essentially over long term doesn't make dramatic differences. We can't take people with severe obesity and put them on good diets and have them. It's only a really small fraction of a percent.
Even the most successful programs, you see a reduction in body weight, and then it comes back up.
And we didn't discuss this earlier, but it's an important point: is that we know from prison studies in the 1950s that they were doing unethical studies on prisoners where they were force feeding them. And this is also a kind of on the calorie intake theory part of hypothesis here. When you force fed calories to prisoners, that was like 10,000 calories a day. They learned that most of the prisoners would only gain about 10% of their body weight. They couldn't get them to gain much more. A small percentage of them, like maybe, I don't know, maybe. So 90% would only gain a small amount, but they would gain something. I'm not saying they would gain nothing, but they wouldn't become 300 or 400 pounds. A small percentage of them would get heavy. So there was some group that was really responsive, but it's actually not most people. It's not most people, at least in the prison studies that were definitely no one should ever do. Again, they're not ethical studies. But if you, so if you think about just that alone, it actually fits kind of what most people's just normal life. And that, like, I don't think that if I ate a massive amount that I could become 500 pounds. And I think that it's true for actually most people I know, but I also do know a small group of people who do have the ability to change weight dramatically. And so it is something, but no matter what, no matter which of those groups you are, you should eat well. You should exercise. That is,
I mean, that's really the punchline, right? It's not that you're, it's not that you should like take away from this that your genes determine your body weight. Therefore, I'm going to eat whatever I want. I can stop exercising. In fact, it's still quite important at an individual level for someone to try their best to live healthy, but don't blame yourself. Don't excoriate yourself because, like it's whatever situation you're in, it's the outcome of a very, very complex set of facts about the world we live in, like the environment that we live in, the genes you inherit from your parents, the whole range of things that are not entirely outside your control. That really matters.
I agree.
At the same time, there are things that are in your control that you should, that you should, I wouldn't say obsess over, but should certainly take advantage of the knowledge we have, right? Eat well, exercise regularly.
Of course. But I actually left out a group in that other one I was talking about, the people who were, well, I guess it just maybe wasn't obvious, that 10% change in body weight group. But that also exists for people who are 400 pounds. And so there is this group of people who, no matter what, they cannot change their body weight. I've met them in the hospital, in the emergency room, and they're sort of hurt by it. I'm there. They tell me I'm eating a meal a day, eating 1,000 calories a day. I'm still 300 pounds and I'm having these injuries because of this. And they know that, and they're trying their hardest. And actually meeting with these people every so often is actually part of an inspiration that's kind of driven me to continue on with what we're working with here. And what we know from well done studies, that the only thing that ends up working for that group of people previously was these surgical interventions of bariatric surgery.
Yeah.
Now we have Ozempic to add to that, which is, has its own controversial things but I don't think there's that much controversy on Ozempic for people who are 400 pounds. I think that the controversy is on people who are, on this borderline weight that they're trying to deal with. And it's not if it's a 400 pounder who's trying to avoid a bariatric surgery, I don't think there's much. And so what that shows also is that there's this genetic component of these people, that the only way to get them to a normal weight is by physically removing a piece of their body or altering the hormones within them. And if you think about it, right, from a grand view of 300, 400 pound people, that years ago, before obstetrics, there was probably about a 0% chance of, as you approach, because these obesity risks that we're talking about from obstetrics aren't you become obese and then your relative risk is the same no matter the degree. There is a spectrum here. And as you approach it, I believe that their chances of delivery eventually approach zero. Now we have a situation where we have multiple people who are at these incredibly high BMIs, who also, a different factor of this genetic component that it's not part of my hypothesis. Other groups have talked about this, is called, there's assortative mating, where people of the same type of physical structure, so people with high BMIs mate with people who have high BMIs and vice versa. And I
mean that's pretty common in societies where there's a strong correlation between socioeconomic status and body weight, which is like basically almost every society, right?
Well, that's a little different than what I'm talking about. It's that unrelated to socioeconomics, people who have the same BMI tend to have a spouse who's the same BMI. And that's been shown, and that would also lead to a change in the gene pool of the population. And then on top of that, there's something called differential realized fertility or fecundity. How many babies do people have? And it turns out that obese people, for whatever reason, have more children than non-obese people, and that could have to do with the poverty thing that you're
yeah. I mean, I think a lot of those interpretations are so confounded with socioeconomic status. It's very difficult to tease those apart.
I agree 100%. But what I'm pointing to here is that they wouldn't be possible until obstetrics happened. Okay, you couldn't have two 400-pound people meet and have children in 1920. That child would not have been born. And the obese women in 1920 could not have had an increased number of children, independent of what the society rules are. They would have less children because they were dying and having and their children were dying at a higher rate, and they were dying. So you end up with this situation where there are these other factors that then come into play once you allow the ability for obese people to have more children. And there's another part of this that I think is really important, and I want to make clear in that this is not, none of this is to advocate that we should not be doing obstetrics to save the lives of obese people.
That was
okay. I think that's implied, and it's obvious, but I just don't.
Well, there's a general thing about the causes of obesity that I think that people. I mean, I think it's part of why the policy around it is so difficult. Almost every single cause of this like rise in population obesity that I've ever seen, it's the result of desirable things. Whatever theory you have, right? It's always a change in technological structures so that make agriculture more efficient, lowers the price of food. Change in the nature of work so we don't have to do heavy physical. The vast majority don't have to do heavy physical work. There are theories that there's a shift in the ability for women to work in the workplace, and so there's less drudgery at home. Every single and now your theory about obstetrics, every single one of these is in a sense in their theories obesogenic.
I understand,
but none of them are bad. Like they're all socially desirable, and so obesity then is the result, the byproduct of a whole bunch of socially desirable things. It's why this is such a thorny policy problem. Like if you really want to address it from its root causes, you're going to undo socially desirable things. Well, no one really wants to do that. Nor should we. Then the question is, we have to think of other ways to address the problems caused by it, and I think just be less judgmental of each other around it.
One more implication that I find I think is incredibly important, and it's not. It may not be obvious, is that this hypothesis that I'm putting forward, unless, if I'm wrong, let's throw it out tomorrow. But I believe that it is not going to be easily destroyed. I've spent 10 years trying to destroy it. I don't actually like it. I hate the theory. I hate the hypothesis. In fact, if anyone here listening today can connect this to an evolutionary biologist, a geneticist, an obesity researcher who can explain to me some simple mistake that I have missed, I would actually really appreciate that, because I don't want to continue promoting an idea that's wrong. If it's wrong, please. But if it's not, if we cannot easily cross it out, even just the possibility of it actually has great implications for how scientific studies are performed. Those twin studies we talked about before, they are presuming there's been no change in the gene pool, and that has dramatic influence on how we're interpreting their data. The GWAS study,
I mean, they're structured such that the gene pool is held fixed, right?
Yes.
Identical twins, right? So it's
presumed, and you cannot. And I believe that
there's stuff to learn from it, but they're going to paint an incomplete picture. Is the point?
I believe we've interpreted it. They're interpreting it potentially incorrectly, and that you need to presume that both of these are possible, and you need to. It is possible that this has happened, and if that's the case, then interpret the data as such. And that may lead to a different interpretation of what they've been putting together here. And the same is true of these genome-wide studies. In fact, when they find in these genome-wide studies, they typically report that there's been no change between generations. That's kind of standard practice, because if you show changes between generations, it's almost presumed that you've done something wrong. And so I'm concerned that there's even a possibility that there has been genome-wide studies that are been bookshelved because they have this change in genes that they were like, well, this destroys our entire study because there's a change in between these generations, and we wanted to look at the difference between how the genes were going to interact with the environment, and now there's a change in the genes, so it destroys the whole study. And so, but the fact that and they're not going to, most places except for that one study, Wu et al., most aren't going to come out and say that they think they have evidence for contemporary natural selection, in the contemporary human population. Natural selection.
I really like your study. I think it's really, really interesting. As we said, I mean, there's some things I think are interesting and angles to like explore. But I think probably, and I think it's very important in the obesity literature that people understand this hypothesis.
Yes.
But I think broadly, the reason why I think I'm attracted to this study is the idea that human populations are not subject to to evolutionary pressures has always struck me as like a too facile an idea, it's just a fact that we must be, right. We have the same kind of biology of the rest of human life in a sense, and so why would we be not subject to those evolutionary pressures? But it also points to the fact that our technological changes, technological advances interplay with those evolutionary forces in ways that maybe weren't true for plants or whatever, right?
History.
Things that don't make these technologies.
For the history of evolution over the last millions of years.
It's a very, very interesting, I think, scientific development to think about those kinds of interactions. And your study, I think, points to a really important potential place where we could like really see it and study it.
Yeah, and that is the idea of technology influencing. It's absurd to believe that our technological influences have not influenced natural selection. And one of my co-authors,
the funny thing is it natural selection anymore, right? It's not classical natural selection. It's not classical Darwinian evolution, right? It's not mutation,
reproductive success. It's reproductive success. So whoever has more children.
There's a selection process, but to call it these are
natural
decisions made by exactly.
Natural is the issue. Natural.
Yeah, exactly.
I get you on that. Yeah, there is differences in reproductive fitness based on evolutionary definition, but
it's just fascinating. I think it's a really interesting way to think about our biology and our societies together.
That's actually the work of one of my co-authors, who's a evolutionary anthropologist, and how I found him was he essentially wrote this article on. He has an index of natural selection by nation, and he demonstrated that there was nations with reduced natural selection have this increase in obesity. And he didn't offer a mechanism in it, but he just said that this reduction in natural selection could be causing this, could be contributing to the obesity rise. So I contacted him, and we've been working on it together. But he's been working on this for multiple different topics, and he's seeing it, and it's things that are people get a little bit uncomfortable with this kind of a thing, and it's because they think that it's implying that these things are bad, but they're not bad. They're good. The interventions are good, but understanding the repercussions are just understanding our universe, our reality. For example,
this is just the worldview that I'm attracted to as with my economics background. Mm-hmm. Everything has trade-offs.
Yes.
Right. There's nothing that's like an unmitigated good. There's always going to be some opportunity cost, some trade-off. And so thinking about it in those ways is I think of course you would never say, let's not have improvements in obstetrics. That is just, that's such a good, the good that's come from that is incredible. That doesn't mean there aren't some other collateral effects. And I think, if you're right, if your theory is right, you've identified one.
I'm happy to talk this through, and I'm really happy to go over this with you. And I just want your listeners to seriously, please contact me regarding this idea. Contact other evolutionary biologists. I can't emphasize this enough. I want to hear if anyone's got what's wrong. This is a major thing here, and it's an interesting idea, and it should be discussed. It should be openly talked about, and I think it's an important piece, at least, to be discussed. I'm not sure I'm right, but I don't know that I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, let me know. Bring their attention to me, and begin a discussion on this. So anyone who wants to contact me, just more information on this, I'm happy to discuss this in greater detail at any moment. So just shoot me an email, and we could go over any things that were not making sense to you, and I'm happy to do that for you.
Well, Joe, thank you again for joining me. It's just an absolutely fascinating paper. But I also want to say thank you for letting me talk about something other than COVID for once.
Yeah,
It's been fun to like put on my let's think about population obesity hat again.
That's basically we all want to. This project started 10 years ago and was on the way to go, and then 2020 hit and it got put away. But so it was impacted by it. But that's I'm happy to have returned back to some sort of a normal type of science that I was trying to do, and this is one of the first things that I'm getting to publish in where it's starting again. That feeling a little bit. Still doing COVID stuff too, but
I think there's still some stuff from COVID I still have left to do.
No,
but
there's a lot.
Yeah.
There's still a lot. But
it is. I do like. I mean, there's a reason I'm a scientist, Joe.
Yeah.
I think there's a reason you're a scientist, and it's fun to do science and think and learn.
Yeah,
okay. So until next time, this has been Professor Jay Bhattacharya for the Illusion Consensus podcast, talking to Dr. Joe Fraiman. Thank you so much, Joe. Until next time.
Has the dust settled from the COVID policy response? Far from it. The storms are many. Inflation, learning losses, ill health, high crime, broken government services, displaced workers, substance abuse, mass loneliness, discredited science, real estate crisis, censorship, and overweening state power. The world is on fire with war, mass killings, crime, hunger, revolution. The lack of accountability, or even so much as an apology, is a foreshadowing. They'll keep their newfound powers and try it all again. Brownstone Institute is seeking answers, undertaking important research and publishing the results while providing fellowships for dissident scholars who have been professionally displaced. It's not about this one crisis. We urgently need to restore peace, prosperity, and integrity in science and journalism. Visit brownstone.org for more. We may never get to the truth, but we can get closer to the truth. There will be no stopping the efforts.